good. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ingrid and Gwendolyn and the university there. I'm also honored to be invited. It's very nice. As Ingrid said, I'm presently in Indonesia, so 12 hours difference than you, but we can do everything now, we think, with technology. We will see about that. So as Ingrid said, I will be presenting a series of projects from Vietnam and from Belgium, and basically trying to explain how we can understand, how we can use the landscape system as we find it, to help us decide where to urbanize and where to not urbanize. Sorry, I have to see how to advance. Yes. So I think we're all pretty well aware by now that we're living in pretty remarkable times. Remarkable times with politics, some good and some really not so good, but also in terms of socio-ecological crises. And of course, we know that one of the major challenges is facing us is what we call the Anthropocene. So it's an age of humans, and we're a very well-known American environmental lawyer. His name is Jedediah Purdy. He said that humanity has now outstripped, so we become more powerful than geology itself. So of course that makes big challenges of how we can intervene as designers, as architects and urbanists. And for me, what becomes very interesting is that architecture, I'm a big believer that design can still change the world, despite pressures that might try to not allow that to happen. But at the same time, I think architecture and urbanism are slightly conservative, where we begin to see, if we look beyond our own discipline, we understand that there's quite a lot of radical thinking. In this case, I show you two book covers. The first one is by a Canadian environmental activist named Naomi Klein, where she puts together and juxtaposes the crisis of the economy and of capitalism, and how it badly affects the environment. And then also another very interesting person is an evolutionary biologist. He's known as E.O. Wilson. He recently died after a career of almost 100 years. And this one book, he's written quite a lot of very interesting and easy to read, nice books. But this book, Half Earth, is where he says, in order for humanity to continue to survive, we probably have to put aside half of the earth without any human life, simply to allow ecology to survive. And actually, he talks to all of his ecology friends and comes up with a list of places where we can keep this wonderful ecology. And quite a lot of it is in Latin America, actually. It's quite interesting. A lot in Central America, a lot in Latin America. So it's a very interesting notion. Another interesting kind of duo who write books together is a woman, Naomi Orkies. She's a professor of the history of technology, and Eric Conway is a professor, a scientist at NASA, and they're amongst these kind of authors who are writing about a paradigm shift that is necessary. It's about how to understand the world and how to understand that we need new knowledge, maybe knowledge that's not so strongly coming from the West, but that starts to look at different indigenous knowledges, recognize a whole host of knowledge that also, you even could say, artificial intelligence is another new kind of knowledge that we have to understand. So in this book, they really map out almost like science fiction, but also written from really science, trying to understand how much of the world is challenged by global warming consequences. We know that around the world, this is just a sampling of the year 2017, a whole series of images that show this Yeah, and sometimes even in the exact same place, you know, where you have incredible fires. Of course, fires burning, many forest fires. They deal with they affect the capacity of roots to hold soil. You have erosion, and then it makes floods even worse. So this kind of flip side of forest and water is something that myself and my colleagues in Leuven have become increasingly a little obsessed with. So what I'm going to try to show to you in a brief kind of synopsis is what is this notion of landscape as urbanism or landscape urbanism. So the idea is that instead of master planning, instead of imposing, say, with all the best intentions, of course, but monofunctional land use onto a territory, it's to understand the intricacies and the special qualities of places and how a landscape can inform, again, where to urbanize, where to not urbanize. But the notion of landscape urbanism, putting together words that usually are not put together, it's about rejecting the notion that they're different. So rejecting the idea that nature and city are two different things, but they can be tied more closely together. Also understanding that landscape urbanism it's not only about design. I would argue that design is, of course, coming from a design perspective, very essential and something that can bring together different fields. But of course, we have to understand that landscapes are systems of ecology and they're alive. And we, as architects, engineers, urbanists, we deal with re-engineering territories, but also it has, of course, to do with social policy and political processes. The interesting thing I think about landscape as urbanism is that landscape itself is something that's continually growing, decaying, dying, regrowing. So it's a process. And if we can begin to understand also cities and even I would say architecture as part of a process, maybe we can begin to think differently. So when did landscape urbanism come up as a term? As a term, it only came in 1996. It started in North America by people like Jim Corner and Charles Waldheim. It then traveled, say, as an ism across the Atlantic Ocean and has become now a bit of a global term. But I would argue that, in fact, it's much, much older. It's almost as old as when humans started to inhabit and settle the earth, because intelligent, say, indigenous landscape urbanism would always start to look at how do we build urbanism without urbanists? How do we build architecture without architects? And of course, we are designers. We are not the without. But for me, the interesting thing is how can we learn from maybe some of these older traditions to also complement, say, a more scientific knowledge. So in that sense, why is it so interesting as a field? I think because of the moment we're in, which is incredible and seemingly getting worse by the day, I would almost say, crises, both political, socioeconomic, cultural, ecologic, but also spatial crisis. And then if we understand, as I said, that we are in this kind of incredible turning point where we have the consequences of global warming, knowing that that is very much driven by the Anthropocene, by humankind's actions. It's not natural disasters. We now are accelerating the natural disasters. But I think it's interesting to understand that we can learn a lot probably from what we call tech, so traditional ecological knowledge, and also indigenous knowledge systems and practices. Sorry for the spelling mistake. And also, but it's not either or. So it's not that we can have tech without sec. So the argument is that we need to kind of course, take on the arsenal of technology we have, science and advancement we have, but also still learn a little bit from the past without being nostalgic. So what I want to quickly do is go through a number of projects. I'm going to try to go quickly through 5, 3 in Vietnam and 2 in Belgium. So I start with this one. This was a commission that we did as part of our research group. So it's primarily with Professor Bruno de Mulder and others, working together with the Vietnamese government. So this was to make a plan for the enormous territory of about 20 million people. So in this part of Vietnam, which is the Mekong Delta. So an incredible system that you see of this green and blue, wonderful water mosaic, but again, heavily populated, almost 20 million people. So these are some very interesting cartographies by French colonialists, of course, for the purpose, as colonialists would do, of extraction. So of draining literally this kind of low-lying swamp to turn it into productive land, and then having settlement that worked with that. What this encompassed, what it needed from the population, as you see, massive amount, armies of primarily men, digging canals to drain this quagmire, to drain this swampy land that would not be habitable without kind of a massive engineering. And so what started to happen is this kind of wild wetland, tropical wetland, started to become very much engineered and domesticated for a huge amount of productive landscape, huge agricultural landscape. So here you see pieces of that. So you have where almost really every centimeter of the land is controlled somehow. There's very little wild left. It's all been somehow engineered. But still, of course, nature has its revenge. Here, there are areas where you see wonderful mangrove systems. But of course, the interesting thing in this kind of climate is that you've got very distinct dry season and wet season. Of course, both of these are changing with global warming. So our project was a commission, I say, from the central government to develop a plan for this region. It's the first time they had regions planned, because they usually do it province by province. So this was trying to look beyond provincial boundaries and trying to come to a logic. So for us, we started to look at what we don't see, which is the soils, in order to understand how we could maybe interfere. We started to look at, and we spend a lot of time redrawing maps. So these maps are showing, on the one hand, the bathymetry, which is actually the topography of the water, so the negative topography. And we use the same color of the topography of the sea and of the land. So you also see that the kind of wettest area is not on the coast, which is what you would think, but it's further back, and looking at things like saline intrusion. For us, then, what was very important, and is a new way to look, again, trying to get rid of the master plan way of thinking, of administrative boundaries, top-down planning. What we worked with was what you see in these 6 different colors of green, blue. They're called agroecological zones. Agroecological zones are so not based on policy of what a government maybe says you should grow in that place, but it's what it's kind of the micro identity and logic of the landscape that includes the soil, the wetness, and shows how, in this case, 6 different areas are very dominant. So we use this as a major strategy to begin to project into the future. Just so you know, for the Mekong Delta, this is in red is the city of Ho Chi Minh, of Saigon. So it's not in the Mekong Delta, but it's next to the Mekong Delta. So part of our whole project was trying to understand topography. In this case, you say a delta is flat and the Mekong Delta is super flat. So it means centimeters make all the difference. So it became all about microtopographies. And what you see in the dotted lines that you see very close to the border in the north of the drawing of Cambodia is roads that we said you absolutely, as a government, this is given roads kind of developed by the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, where they would have to take gigantic loans. We said you absolutely should not build these roads, because if you actually look at flooding maps in the future, by the time you build them, they will already be underwater. So we tried to reconfigure infrastructure as a way to begin. This was eventually, so our say master plan, we had to still call it a master plan. We didn't like the word, but it's the only legal mechanism they have in Vietnam. But this was a final drawing of this plan. And as you see, it has a lot to do with, so in the red are kind of urban areas, but it also has a lot to do with identifying very strongly the productive landscapes. And then particularly in the north, where you see the blue areas, we had an idea to create gigantic, say, reservoirs to hold the wet water in the wet season and to redistribute it down in the dry season. Another big part of this project, before we start talking about urban typologies, was to bring back mangroves. So here you see a whole system of bringing back mangroves. So the darkest green along the water, or the more solid green, is mangroves. And then behind it, with more white in between, is the idea that this becomes a productive landscape where you can also have some shrimp and fish farming. We said all the islands in the arms of the big rivers, the Mekong River and its tributaries, should become not habited, but just become part of landscape reserves. And then we started to develop typologies. So if you remember going back, I just show you a little bit, one typology, this map shows it easier, in black. This is one typology that we had on stilts, so in the area that's meant to be flooded the most. The areas in blue are the areas that are the most productive land, and where we said we need the most population and they can live on the land. And then the areas in red are the areas that we saw as being on stilts, because they will also be flooded, but they also they need to float, because they would get knocked over if they were only on stilts because of the power of the waves. So this upland area where we develop these gigantic places to catch monsoon waters, we created these huge man-made lakes where you could also have a new kind of fish industry. And then we developed houses here that you see are all on stilts. All of the typologies for us would be including their own solar production. So each house and cluster would really be self-sufficient. And each small cluster of houses would have a public space. And that public space would be the link between the land on the dike to the water system. Another typology of the urban structure is which was the most of the population, is where we would kind of build high dry islands of urbanism. So where we would literally raise the ground by 2 or 3 meters, which is the tradition there, but to keep it more as islands instead of everywhere. And around you have this low flooded land. And you also have a productive landscape that is not monocultural. So where you have different crops and even energy production that can happen together. And then the final typology for this area was really along the coast, where we said we want to bring back different systems of mangroves, and then have kind of clearings in the mangrove forest, where again we have housing clusters, very simple clusters that again have some kind of self-sufficiency, but then a public space that's also working as a kind of opening amongst the mangroves. So part of this whole story, and this project was presented as almost 500 pages of drawings, not so much text, which surprised the Vietnamese very much. But also this kind of cartoon drawings that a colleague of ours made. The idea was to really try to get rid of their notion of monofunctional zoning. So where the last one, where you could have a kind of proximity of monkeys in the mangroves near urbanization, but each having their own system that had an in-between space where you could kind of live human and non-human in similar places. Similarly, introducing things like in the first image of marketplaces and industry. So again, getting rid of this kind of very strict monofunctional zoning, which is something that they adhere to still today, unfortunately, in the Vietnamese context. So in that sense, we tried to take, because they still use master planning as their legal mechanism, we also tried to create new land use types to introduce them into their growing system of national categories of land use. So we tried to kind of invent a few new land use types that we could bring back into the system. Because right now for instance, they just say forest, or they just say productive land, but we tried to nuance things to give more specificity of the landscape and of the buildings, so that we could do this. Now I'm going to jump quickly to Belgium. This is so I'm focusing in this first part a little bit about water urbanism, and then I'll go to forest. And then the last two projects will combine water and forest urbanism, because they're very much alike. They're very much flip sides of the same coin. So here, what you can see is a quite interesting map that's based, if there's a 3-meter sea level rise. So this doesn't even include the sinking of land, which we know is also a problem everywhere. So this is simply raising the sea. And we see that quite a lot. So this is Belgium, the Netherlands, the Belgian coast is here. And the area that I'm going to be showing you is right next to the border with the Netherlands. So this was a project that was a competition that we luckily won, but it was only luckily also an ideas competition. So we didn't have to build something, because we would be a little incapable as some lost professors. So this competition was, in fact, an interesting concept. So this is the big city of Antwerp, and this is the Antwerp port, so a major port in Europe. The port was meant to go to the other side of the river, and in order to do this, to stay aligned with European regulations, they call them a compensation landscape. So if you want to build more industrial land, you need to, so here the Antwerp port needed to expand. And they said, okay, Antwerp port, you can expand, but if you take this, you have to give back to nature. So nature compensation, you have to give another piece of land back to nature. So our competition was actually to look at this area between this new port and this area that's a wetland in the Netherlands. This dotted line is the border, and this was our site. So for us, what was very interesting is in doing field work and studying the site. So these are our fieldwork photographs with Google and some archival work, is understanding that we read this landscape as 3 very different landscapes. So a very beautiful tidal landscape, so a natural landscape, and then a man-made landscape with dikes, different than the Dutch, because in Belgium you can have trees on your dike, and in Netherlands you cannot. And then, of course, we liked very much, okay, being strange architects, we like also the industrial landscape, the port landscape. So we saw it as also a quality to recognize and to kind of celebrate. And what was so interesting about this project is they invited architects and urbanists to landscape architects to think about it, because part of the compensation is that they would break these dikes to allow this land to be flooded. So a historical landscape of centuries. So this actually sign is saying stop depoldering. So don't cut our dikes. This is our cultural landscape. You might have to do it for policy and for big things and for economics, but like we live there and it's our landscape. So everybody knew, because it was such a huge policy imposition, that it was going to happen. So the competition was a little bit, how can we do this without losing everything? So to put it simply. So again, we spend a lot of time in our work redrawing maps to make the map itself tell a story as a way to communicate with non-designers. So on the left is the existing condition. A very strange place. So all these dark lines are dikes. So they're all different heights. And this gray thing is a gigantic nuclear power plant. So a kind of very surrealistic site with these cute little Flemish houses on dikes. And then this gigantic nuclear power plant. And also a very strange combination of things. So what we did is we decided to break the dike in a few pieces, as you see, to allow nature to come back in, and then to create what we call this new dike that uses some of the tracing, but a mother dike is what they call it. So a big new dike. So we create 3 landscapes. Again, this tidal landscape, number 1. Number 2 is a brackish water landscape. So a mix of salt water and of fresh water. And then a freshwater landscape, where we also tried to keep some of the existing urban settlements, protecting them with landscape forms. So the first landscape was really this very dynamic. There was a very beautiful farm we wanted to keep by putting around it Corten steel panels and letting it kind of die its natural death. So we made some architecture games. This would be the before and after always, so of the landscape. Then with this gigantic new dike, so you would not see anymore this housing, but you would have a new landscape. The second landscape was this one that was more a mix of the 2 kinds of waters. And again, here you see the existing condition, and again the new big dike, and you have a new system where you start to have a new kind of biodiversity that comes back. And then finally, a very artificial landscape, very Cartesian freshwater landscape that also humans could go into. But again, separating, so still having dikes to protect some of this valuable architecture, but allowing people to come into this area. So the idea is to bring more water. We need more space for water, more notion of sponges, and also compensating. But to recognize, so again, a before and after, keeping some wonderful heritage by protecting it with kind of dikes, and then allowing a different system to come in. I stay in Belgium, and I jump to so for many years, we were involved and very obsessed with water. And part of that story, always in the background, is that water and forest and vegetation really need each other. They live kind of in tandem. And so we as myself and Professor Bruno de Mulder, we developed a workshop some years ago about the forest of Brussels. So here you see the city of Brussels, so the so-called Pentagon in the core area in dark red, with its kind of sprawl around in progressively getting lighter. And what's very interesting, so Leuven is somewhere over here. This is a gigantic forest that's almost as big a footprint as the city of Leuven, city of Brussels. It used to be even much bigger, but it's been, of course, shrinking over time. So we are really interested in trying to understand the figure, the shape, the morphology of this forest, and particularly all the systems of the urbanism around it. and how they could more work together, because we know there's always a pressure of landscape being eaten by urbanism, whether it's eating lowlands and water landscapes or eating vegetation and agricultural landscapes. So here it's a kind of overlay of the kind of history of how big. So in the green dots, that's forest that once was, that is no longer there. And again, the orange is it's a time of how the city was growing. So how the two are working together. Of course, like everywhere, a big kind of responsible destroyer of things is infrastructure. So here we understood that is a challenge, but also now an opportunity as we try to move to new forms of mobility. So maybe we can literally fix some of these strangleholds. Another big challenge we know is also of suburbanization. That's, as you see, the forest, and then these more wealthy, richer suburbs. They also want a piece of the forest, so slowly rules and policies, compromise, politics gets involved, and the forest is destroyed and starts to become part of a suburban environment. And then also the ecology itself is radically changing. First culprit of the change of the forest was, of course, agriculture and urbanism, but then also planting different species that are maybe non-native. So what we try to do, and this is an issue a thing we do in quite a few recent projects, is trying to understand how you can have more of everything. So how can we have more urbanism and more forest and more water and more, no? So it's not either or. So of course that means densification. And how to do that is about also transferring development rights. So it involves heavily policy and very, very good political will, which we know is not always so easy to have. So I won't really go through, these were just to analyze the system in order to intervene. We also, and I will just go through these really quickly, we try to, as you'll see, so look at the systems that developed historically through being tied to water, ones that were more about ridges, so understanding the relationship again to topography, ones that were more about agriculture, and then this kind of massive urban tissue in the kind of post-war period. And then this kind of ribbon development, very typical, say, sprawl along regional roads, national roads, and then these kind of gigantic suburbanization that came in different waves. And then the final one, which for us is highly problematic, is what we say dormitory urbanism. So not very much quality, but housing a lot of people who just live in a place and commute to work and to whatever. So we try to reconfigure settlements that contained this sprawl, and also to try to thicken and to change what you see as a quite monofunctional relation of green and blue. So trying to change forest types where we get something like this. So where we use the water as a way to reconnect lost streams and as a way to create ecological stepstones through new figures of forest, because we know everywhere in the world, just plant trees. That'll already help a lot with global warming and with carbon sequestration. So in the end, we developed this kind of, this was done not as a commission, this was done in a 2-week workshop with international young architects. And this was the kind of plan we ended up making. So again, putting together where the blue and the various blues and the various greens become very, very strong, and they help more define than where these different colors of urbanization can come in and not just kind of seep and sprawl endlessly into the landscape. we then developed with this incredible group of young architects, some students, but more young architects from various places. We developed 5 different sites. I will just show you 2 where we worked, or 3. So this is one very close, as you saw from the map, at the edge of Brussels, and it was really about bringing a lot more water back into the city, and creating water not only to deal with flooding, but also to deal with creating new public space in the city. This is an area where we also wanted to bring in more productive landscape. So understanding how can you have urban agriculture to get and for orchards together with new systems. So the new urbanization here is in orange. So this was new. There's still a need for new urbanization. And then finally, also, this is an area looking at one of these kind of horrible ribbon developments and how to reorganize shopping malls and quite ooky things into kind of collective housings that work together with different forest systems. And same in a kind of over to the west, some of the say suburban belt to move into a different density rather than the single family house. So getting rid of this kind of each man his castle and trying to literally break down fences and to create more new collective landscapes, new public spaces, and also working with some of the agricultural spaces and allowing creating more bringing in more biodiversity, and also allowing a mix of the human and the non-human in a very explicit way. So that was again a short workshop. And then I go to the last 2 projects that tried to bring together water and forest. This first one was, again, a commission of Professor de Mulder and I. First time, and probably last time, that we worked for a private developer in Vietnam. A very interesting woman, very tough woman. She thinks she fired us, and we think we quit, so it didn't end well. But we, anyways, enjoyed the project while we were working on it. As you see, it's a city. Well, it's a city outside, a territory outside of Ho Chi Minh City. So it's not so far away from a gigantic mega city. And the developer wanted to make an eco town. So this is the kind of landscape that you had. And this is showing its location. So between the area just north of where this, I don't know if you're seeing my mouse, but where the pink box is just to the north is Ho Chi Minh City. And so this is a kind of interesting hinge between the Mekong Delta and so Ho Chi Minh City is in white here. The Mekong Delta is here. And so this site is kind of in between. The dark green are mangroves. A lot of this is agriculture and aquaculture, as you saw, and our site was along this river. So again, a lot of time drawing and redrawing, collecting information from a lot of different sources. They don't have good GIS in Vietnam, so we had to do a lot of wasting time tracing, Google Earth and all of those kind of things. But really working on this strangely shaped site due to what the developer was allowed to buy. And this is the kind of site we had. So a little bit also of kind of sprawl. Here you see the big river that we're on, and then smaller rivers inside. And it's basically this territory that's agriculture, but looking, needing to be, according to the developer and the pressures of the market, heavily urbanized. So for us, it was a very interesting site, again, because it has this, well, clearly it's water, but also the kind of importance of the forestry is there. So this is the plan we ended up making. So again, if you see my mouse, but even if you don't, north of this is an existing city. So we had, our plan was basically creating an extension of the city in the north, a middle area that we created and kept as a very wet landscape with 3 islands that have, say, collectives like universities, hospitals, and then in the south, and more an agriculture, an experimental agriculture, aquaculture landscape with its housing. So those show a kind of, again, having to do zoning in Vietnam. So we always try to avoid zoning, but we have to legally do zoning. So it's this kind of fight we have with ourselves of how to not do what we have to do. But here you see, I think, a strong figure of the most urban area, and then a quite different with the islands, and then this kind of mix of aquaculture and agriculture. So the way we developed it is also, we said that it's really a pity to continue this in such a wet landscape to fill it in with land and to build roads. Why don't we use the water as a structure? So we expanded. Instead of building roads, we dug deeper the canals, existing streams and more canals, creating a port. And the idea we had is that from Saigon, you could take your boat to work instead of a car. So in the dry season, you would have a series you would have a base of water, of course, but in the wet season, you would get quite a lot more, again, playing with centimeters of difference. And then we had a whole system of the forestry. So where we have, again, some mangroves on the big river, street trees, but then also a whole system of riverine vegetation along the rivers and different orchards in the south. Here you see the river landscapes a little bit more, and then still a productive landscape. So the productive landscape for us was wet productive things like lotus and different water spinach, and in the south, more traditional agriculture and aquaculture. But basically, we had this strong green-blue system that then became the basis for the urban structure. So we went back and forth, but we really wanted the green and the blue to be the frame for the urban. And then, of course, having more a dispersed system of larger schools and social infrastructure. And then what we developed is this kind of typology. If you see where we have roads and water kind of working as fingers. So we have a water system and a road system that interlock. And then you develop typology. So you have the road system and then a water system. So you start to have a system that has the two working hand in hand in different sizes to work. And then the last project I want to show, it's a work in progress. It's what we're presently busy with. And we've been developing it as a research together with the city of Ho Chi Minh, or Saigon, as it was once called. And just a few weeks ago, I finished a studio with 14 students from around the world, where we traveled to Vietnam for 2 weeks, and then so I will show you a little bit of what they did. What this project is about is it has a lot to do with Ho Chi Minh City is a mega city. It's growing like crazy. It's kind of a Wild West or Wild East. A lot of development and kind of running over their landscape. So right now, Ho Chi Minh City has it only has less than 1 meter, much less than 1 meter of open space per capita. And if you see that the WHO recommends 9, so they're really lacking in open space. And so our idea was, as they keep developing, making more and more plans, how can we convince them that they need to make a metropolitan park system? So once upon a time, we had great park systems, 19th and 20th century, that were kind of the foils to modernization. So we said, well, how do we do that? How do we do that today to counter this? So we started with a very large area of 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. So here's where you see Saigon. Here you see a UNESCO mangrove reserve, and a very interesting drainage canal here that keeps the city safe, that they want to fill up with industry because it's cheap land. So what we did is we start with a topography map. So the more white, the more low. And this was a vision that, say, again, Bruno and I developed how do we keep, sorry, it's on an automatic timer for some reason. How do we keep so how do we design this kind of green to create a metropolitan park system? And then how can we, in different ways, create different systems of urbanization? On the one hand, that makes a strong urban edge that you see in the dark orange, and in other areas, more working in the higher crests of land between the valleys. So we developed this overall strategy, and we've been having workshops in Saigon, and are continue to do that in next month again. But at the same time, we gave the studio students, 14 students, we chose 6 sites that you see here. Well, it's on a timer. 6 sites. So 2 in this system around so all peripheral sites, 2 around the kind of west and south, 2 along the Saigon River, and 2 along another river. So you see them as kind of pairs. And then we said the same thing. We have to change development rights to allow people to have more urbanization, because the city is still really, really, really growing, but also how to save landscape. So we started to develop systems like this. How do we move from this kind of division of different also typologies to have more mixing and to always have more public space? Sorry. So then we made a few premises that all the students followed. We said we will have no landfilling. So as I told you before, this place is a swamp. It's really low. What they typically do is they fill 3 meters, and they've run out of sand. Actually, they're stealing sand. There's a sand crisis in the world, by the way. So we said no landfilling. You have to use what we have. We only use native vegetation, and we consider growing. And every site that the students worked on had to have new housing. So these are the sites we chose. So the sites we chose, as you see, they all have significant open spaces remaining, but they're all highly threatened. So there were 6 sites, and there were 2 or 3 students on each site. And I'm just going to show you 2, the 2 that I've outlined. So this is the first one. It's really in the city center of Saigon. As you see, it's something all the developers want to get their hands on, because it's really next to the urban core. It's an incredible, beautiful site. And this is on the left is what it is now, and this is the master plan by the government of how they want to kind of eat up the landscape. So with this was a group of 3 students, and the exercise we did, I taught it together with a Vietnamese woman who's a PhD student, is I had them making, so before we went to Vietnam, they made the model on the left is what they did before they went. It's the topography. So it's made just with canson paper. Every piece of paper is 25 centimeters. So they showed a few meters of, so it's just the land. So it's just of the earth. So, and then you see on the right side is the new, say, earthwork from which, on top of which buildings sit. So you see they make a lot of space for water, but they also try to make, so here they build inside a canal that's no longer used. You'll see they develop some crazy buildings. So each student then worked on a section. These were all drawn over 3 meters long in the studio, so it's of 1.5 kilometer. And this student was putting a building, you see, in the canal, and the idea is that they all developed a section and then a section perspective. So again, developing the landscape to help them decide how and where to urbanize. And you'll see quite few of these Latin American names. These were some students from your part of the world. But again, so it was a real kind of push to how to design the land, literally the land itself through topography, and to resculpt it without landfilling, and then to develop new typologies. The other side I want to show you quickly is this one, A2. It's also has a huge new highway going through it, but it still has this incredible, beautiful system of wetlands. So that's what you see here, and partially here. And again, the master plan is kind of horror of wanting to fill in so much of it with just the pink and the orange is just urban, yellow too. So it's only the blue that would be remaining landscape. So the students weren't allowed just to make landscape because that's easy. Huh? So they had to make also a lot of housing. So the idea was how to sculpt the landscape to solve issues of global warming, of flooding, of heat island, and at the same time, how to make space and how to develop brand new typologies that create really good new public space. So this group created 3 different kind of lands, like a flooded forest and a lotus forest. This was a really beautiful project by one of the students from Colombia along the highway, but then creating this whole kind of inner world of a landscape with buildings. This was working together with a woman from China, also working in the lotus landscape. And then finally, Gabriela, who's from Ecuador, working also in this, being very fascinated with these little kind of alleyways and how to turn that into a system of public space, also 3-dimensional public space, and then eventually getting a landscape that has less and less people. So you start heavily people landscape, and then it becomes more landscape based. This was field work by boat, by motorbike. We had a wonderful 5x5 model, literally floor plan, where the students were using cutting paper on the floor to develop the project and changing it. We were constantly working together. And then this was part of our mid-review where we had all the drawings and the models, say, live. We decided to not use digital. I've personally started getting tired of PowerPoint presentations in studios. So we decided to do it all with models and with printed drawings. And it was very nice because our jury members started drawing on the drawings, much to some of the shock of the students, but it was very nice. So just as a summary, ending, kind of, some 6, I would say, strategies that we have been trying to develop in various projects, say still all work in progress, but how we can kind of restore ecologies, how we can deal particularly with coasts to deal with sea level rise, how water urbanism can mitigate and adapt to both floods and droughts. I think a big thing we have to do in the future as architects and at the scale of buildings and the scale of cities is really understand more about energy, energy landscapes, and new forms of transportation. This notion of agroecological regions for us is really interesting. The FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, has mapped the whole world according to agroecological zones, which you can find. You could find it for Peru. And it's really interesting to see what they say the land wants to be, not what humans want it to do. So it's a quite nice, for us, it's a very interesting discovery of this agroecological way of thinking. And then finally, I say, like, forest urbanism for us is a kind of very interesting counterpart to water urbanism. And we know that we need it for microclimates and for more and more carbon sinks. So with that, I thank you very much. And again, thank Ingrid and the others for inviting me. And I hope that we have time for some discussion.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Now we will have some questions from the students and from the professors. We have one already.
Hi, Kelly. How are you?
Hello, how are you?
Good.
Nice to see long ago faces.
Yeah. We have a question here. It's how can we explain to our authorities, to local authorities, why it's important to think about urban planning from the perspective of the landscape and not just infrastructure, like strategies, like all the visuals that you mentioned before, and also thinking about Lima as a desert based with some valleys. How can we explain that to a authority that landscape urbanism is important in a desert? Because in a rain context, it's easy because you have flood, no? But how can you do that in this context, no?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good question, and I'm by no means an expert in desert regions. I can already say as an excuse to not answer it perfectly. But I think that the question of how do we convince local authorities and politicians of the importance of this other way of thinking, because I think we know everywhere in the world that still infrastructure is the main way of progress, as seen by authorities. But I think what we start, the first time I think we had a very strong impact of questioning infrastructure development as the kind of forerunner to urbanism was when we started making maps and showing how much damage the infrastructure would do, or how much, well, for instance, when I showed the Mekong Delta plan, we had two roads that we showed. I mean, you're so stupid if you put them there, because these areas are predicted by scientists to be flooded. So you're kind of putting the money in the wrong place. So I think part of what we have to communicate, and I think we can do a lot of communication through graphics and through drawing, is trying to highlight data from different people. So from hydrologists, from foresters, from people who are experts about deserts. So a bit going out of our design world to understand. That's why for me, agroecological regions is so interesting. It's not knowledge of architects or urbanists. It's the knowledge of the soil. It's the knowledge of the climate. And if we start to look at and understand with a lot of help by other experts, I think I think what architects are good at is visualization. So if we can visualize some of the complicated science and put it on the territory, so not keep it in abstract models, but bring it very close to an understanding people can see, we can deal with it. Then how to deal in a desert. I mean, for me, that's it's a whole world. As I say, I know very little about. I have traveled once to Peru. It was a wonderful place. And I've worked with some students who have been working in your context. But of course, I think for me, what's also fascinating, and maybe, I don't know if you guys know it, I will put it also in the chat. It's a woman named Rosetta Elkin. She is she's a professor in Pratt in the United States, and she wrote a book called Plant Life. And what she does in this, I've written it in the chat. So what she talks about in this is she uses three contexts of deserts. So she uses the Sahara, a part of China, and part of, well, not desert, but in the US Western plains. And she talks about, so much in the air with politicians these days, or we need to bring trees, we need to bring forest. But she said, we can't bring forests everywhere. Maybe deserts don't, again, if you look at agroecological thinking, it's the soil of your context is not suitable maybe to forest, even though it's now kind of seen as a cure-all. And so this book of Rosetta Elkin is really brilliant, because she talks about how we need to understand also arid regions and super arid regions, desert regions, that have a whole nother system of life. And so I think, again, I can't answer it precisely because I don't know enough about, but her plea, and I think some people who are looking into these areas, is to really try to understand what is the, say, ecological, biological, and scientific way of understanding a desert context, to then know how to work as architects and urbanists in it. So I think it's, again, acknowledging that we don't have all the knowledge, no, that we have to work with people who are experts in soil, experts in all the subsurface condition. I think the subsurface condition in a desert is even more important to understand than in a wet area. So it's not a great answer, but it's not an easy question for someone who's working in deltas, no? Sorry, I can't do better.
Thanks, Kelly.
We have a question from the professor's perspective. How do you deal with all these different backgrounds for the projects?
Background, what kind of background do you mean?
Different nationalities and ways of looking at nature and city.
So I think for us, what's really interesting is that I think we, as design researchers, but also as teachers, when we work with students, we don't have say a form of landscape urbanism or a system as such, but I think we have a method of trying to read territories, to try to map them. So we spend a lot of time making maps and trying to gather data that's maybe not even spatial, and trying to make it spatial. And we do it kind of stupidly and naively, and then we bring it back to the experts and they correct us. So for instance, the soil map I showed of the Mekong Delta, we made one soil map, and we had a guy he told us the soil map we made was completely wrong and stupid and bad. And then he gave us a lecture of 3 hours and then showed us how to make another map. So it was really nice. So it means a lot of kind of discussion with others. And I think really going beyond our discipline, because I think the crises we have in understanding landscape systems, we don't know, we don't have the knowledge as architects, and even landscape architects. I have quite a lot of friends who are landscape architects. I mean, they still work with botanists, they still work with hydrologists. They also don't consider themselves experts. So I think one is working across disciplines. And then for us, I can say, well, I've personally been involved in Vietnam since '97. So I'm not Vietnamese, I don't speak Vietnamese. But I really try to always work with Vietnamese. So whenever we work on a place, Gennaro and Ingrid both know this, we don't try to jump into context where we don't have locals to support us and to work with us. So in Vietnam, for instance, we work so long there, and we talk a lot. We're not anthropologists, we're not ethnographers, but we try to gain knowledge from help by different fields, and trying to really, because I think the point of the socio-cultural context is really as important as the scientific one. So understanding what's the meaning of nature, what are the customs, and that's where also this kind of traditional ecological knowledge comes into play. So trying to understand not only, also in Vietnam, not only the knowledge from the Vietnamese hydrologist and forester, but also the different ethnic groups. They have very different perceptions of nature and culture and maybe mythologies. And so we try to read a lot, and reading for me also novels and children's stories are often very good to understand landscapes, because I think a lot of stories of and mythology comes from at least in many cultures, I think, come from legends, and so I think it's a way we can do this, and again, working with multiple disciplines, and I would say even multiple generations, so from professionals to students, I think helps. But I think we ourselves always recognize, at least in Vietnam, and for me also in Belgium, because I'm also not Belgian, that the outside view is an outside view. We always are conscious of that. And it has, I think the outside view also to me has strengths and weaknesses. The strengths are you're not caught up maybe in all of the difficulties the way the locals are. You can't do this, you can't do that. You can kind of jump a little bit. But of course you're handicapped by not really knowing the language and knowing so for me in Belgium, working with Bruno, it's interesting because he's Belgian, he's Flemish, and the knowledge is so deeply in him, and sometimes more outside, naive, stupid questions from me force him to be able to explain it in a way that makes him reconsider it. No, so I think that process of kind of insider outsider is as important as kind of this inside outside of discipline also. So, but I think for me, it's really important also in all of the projects we do and the projects we do with students. Well, we had, parallel to our Vietnam studio this year, we had a studio in Palestine, and of course, unfortunately, with the horrific, we couldn't go to Palestine to do field work, but we did it together with a university in Palestine, and the students there were virtually helping our students, and we had a Palestinian teacher. So we always try to make sure that we're doing our best to try to understand the socio-cultural context as much as we can, knowing that it's never enough, but it's a continual learning process for us.
We have another question. How to use the design studio as a tool for research in real class?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's the foundation of our, to date, I think our programs are going to be radically changing, I have to say. But to date, I think our postgraduate programs, and the only way I want to be involved in teaching, in fact, is linking teaching to research. Because to me, that's what's very exciting about education. If we understand that the most important people in the world are the next generation, finding a way to work with the new minds, the new ideas, but also tying it back to research that maybe is decades old, is really fruitful for both sides. So for the old guys and for the youngsters. But also, I think for me personally, having been engaged, I really kind of fell into Vietnam, you could say by accident, back in '97. But I've kind of stubbornly not left it, because instead of jumping around to a different context, I like to travel the world. I like different contexts, no doubt. But for me, trying to kind of stick with Vietnam for quite some decades also helps build the research. So it's not an in and out research, but where the research is kind of getting different layers and different projects. So we usually try to combine research projects, but for us, research project is also design research. So we also we're very active in trying to work on projects with the local government, and then to tie research with local government back to local universities. So we kind of try to make a triangulation between government and professional bodies. an experiment. I told you with a private developer that didn't go so well, but and with universities. So I think for me the studio is a wonderful environment because to me I'm always so. I mean, this last studio I showed you that is really fresh, just finished a few weeks ago. For me, it was really fantastic to do because the students' ideas were, we didn't make any secret of it. We showed them our, say, beginning point, and we said take it or leave it and criticize it, and then, but it became a quicker way for them to get deeper into design instead of having to start from scratch. But then it also, when we now will take it back into the bigger research projects, it gives us a lot of new food for thought, surely. So I think they both feed each other in a nice way. In the most, not always, of course, it's easier said than done, but in the most ideal conditions, they kind of are kind of feeding one another. I'm not hearing you, Ingrid.
Yes, now I realize. How
Sorry.
how can we yeah, how can we get developers to understand the importance of preserving the landscape as part of their projects?
Yes, that's probably the biggest. If anybody has that answer, they win the golden ticket, no? Well, I was a bit making jokes, but not really. I mean, the Kanjuk project that I showed, the second to last one. We were very excited to begin to work with a private developer. It's a woman developer, which is not usual in Vietnam. She made her fortune with dairy farming, so with cows and yogurt and who knows what, and then decided to invest her money as a kind of bank in development. So at first we met her and started working, and all of her staff took us to lunch afterwards and said, oh, you're the first foreigners and first architects that she actually likes. And we were thinking, oh, great. Working. And then all of a sudden, we gave the plan with water and forest. And then they said, yes, it's all very nice, but can you just change it like this? And there was no landscape left, no? And that's where we said, no, I'm sorry, we quit this project. Or as I said, she thinks she fired us and we think we quit. But we had gotten to us. I think it's really finding to find the right developer. I think it's not easy. Maybe as a small side note, for me, one of my, say, heroes, if you're still allowed to have heroes these days, is a man named Kong Jianyu. He's Chinese landscape architect, who's really wonderful person and great landscape architect. So he makes wonderful projects. But one of the most important things he did is he's very charismatic. He's able to speak to, I don't know, Xi Jinping, but at the same time speak to the farmer. He can kind of adjust himself to his audience really well. And what he did a number of years ago is he started kind of being a salesman for architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism. He started going around the country to local municipalities. He said the local municipality, even in the kind of communist Chinese system, is where things happen. And he started kind of speaking in a very charming, but also way with no jargon, and trying to explain to bureaucrats how important is landscape, how important are things, and how they should hire developers who respect keeping the water, bringing in landscape. So he was able to deliver to leaders who are then hiring developers. Okay, Chinese context, but he's to convince them that if they don't do something big and include landscape, not just going back to the first question, not just roads, that they were going to lose all their investment in the end because in the long term, we know that the global warming consequences are so strong. So to me, it's really finding charismatic leaders, whether they're political leaders, municipal leaders, and very kind of visionary developers. Of course, there's not, well, we're all critical of developers. So finding the few in between, but I think inevitably it's going to be, I think the other story we were trying to show is that it can be win-win. It doesn't have to be either a great landscape urbanism project or a kind of crass neoliberal go crazy development money scheme, but it can be both. Like, how can we still have return, profit, money, and landscape systems? So I think that's where design then becomes super important. So how can we have not a developer plan or say utopian plan, but how can we have more landscape and more urbanism? So more money for the developer, but also more space for the monkeys and the birds and the rats, as Bruno would say, to have more of everything, you know, instead of one canceling the other out. Again, easier said than done, we know, but
Well, we want to thank you very much. I learned a lot when I met you. I found that design and urban design is different to what the book and theory says. And when we met again in 2019, then my mind exploded again because I saw there in the workshops things that we are not used to. How you have shown us how to map nature first, or in a more important way than urban infrastructure, and I think that's a great lesson for us to think about and work on it, especially as professors. Thank you very much, Kelly.
thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you to their whole team there, and really to all the students. You're the future. So we look to you to do fantastic and radical things. I think
Yes.
we need radicality, I would ask.
Enjoy Indonesia. See you. Hope to see you soon.
Yes, me too. Thank you very much, Ingrid, and everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.